The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene and you're listening to Durian ASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing. Today, we bring you an analysis on Malaysia, whether it's going to be achieving towards a high-income country by 2020. We have here Rajiv Biswas. He's the Asia-Pacific Chief Economist at IHS. Hi.
Hi, happy to be on your program.
Yes, happy to have you here as well. But before that, just a bit of a background about yourself and the IHS.
Well, basically, I'm in the economic forecasting business, so we look at the outlook for every economy in the world. So my focus is on the Asia region. So particularly looking at what's happening around about the ASEAN region, North Asia, South Asia, and other parts of the region.
So you are focusing specifically on Malaysia in this particular research. What is your finding?
Well, I think Malaysia has made a lot of progress in the last 5 years towards becoming a high-income economy. So it's well on the way to becoming one of the advanced economies of Asia. And I think that reflects a lot of government efforts over the last 5 years, as well as steady progress over a much longer time period, and building up quite a diverse economy across many different industry sectors. So I think this is something that has been in progress for some years already, but the outlook still remains relatively positive in my view for Malaysia.
But how do you make the classification whether Malaysia is currently upper middle income or whether it's high income or lower income? What is the indicators?
Well, the normal definition of whether a country is low income, middle income, or high income is done by the World Bank. So every year the World Bank produces a set of numbers according to which they rank countries. So at the moment, according to the current per capita income of Malaysia, it's ranked as an upper middle income country. So it's really basically using the per capita GDP of a country and classifying a country accordingly.
So it's just the GDP?
Yes.
I see.
So it's defined according to just GDP per capita. And of course, Malaysia has already done pretty well by becoming an upper middle income country. But I think when it becomes an advanced economy, that's quite a significant step, because it will become one of the few countries in Asia that's an advanced economy, which of course also puts its own share of responsibilities on Malaysia, because it will have much more of a leadership role in the Asia region as one of the advanced economies.
But a lot of people are questioning whether Malaysia even an upper middle income country, because they question regarding on the indicator of just using GDP and also the distribution of wealth in this country, especially recently with a lot of questioning about inequality and issue about wealth and all that. So what is your point of view about this?
I think this is an issue that runs across all countries. I mean, many countries are concerned about issues of inequality. So it's certainly not only Malaysia that has that debate. Even the US, there's a big debate about, that a certain, segment of the population control most of the assets, and that the large majority have a relatively smaller share. So this is an issue that's, is affecting every country, and there's a debate in every country. But I think overall, you certainly need to take account of the distribution of income. But I would say that when you look at Malaysia, it's still doing reasonably well. And if you look at other indicators, just, how the country is performing in terms of infrastructure, such as roads, airports, or urban infrastructure, housing, then I would say that those are consistent with Malaysia being a upper middle income country right now. because in general people do have a reasonable standard of living when you compare it to some of the very poor countries around the world. So I don't think it's a unfair categorization right now to say that Malaysia is an upper middle income country, although I understand that the general population do feel maybe somewhat frustrated at, rising living costs, especially since the GST has been introduced, and that affects their, perceptions about whether they're making progress. But I think when you look at the nation as a whole, it certainly has made a lot of progress in the last 10 years. And since the East Asian crisis, it's really quite a remarkable recovery for Malaysia, because at the time of the East Asian crisis in 1997, 98, the banking sector was in great trouble. The property market had collapsed. There was a lot of macroeconomic problems in Malaysia, and right now it's looking like one of the most successful countries in Asia, actually, with a very much more stable banking sector. The property sector looks, in reasonably good shape, although there are certainly concerns that prices have gone up too much in some areas. And in general, the economy has done relatively well.
But why there's a disconnection of perception between Malaysians and also the idea of an upper middle income nation that is being categorized by World Bank?
Well, I think in every country there's always the perception that perhaps they're not doing as well as people might say. So I don't think it's a unique issue in Malaysia and Europe as well, of course. They've had now the economic crisis, and many European countries, which most people would consider are reasonably well off in Northern Europe, places like Netherlands, France, which most people would categorize as being some of the richer countries in the world, also have very big debates going on about, the situation for ordinary people. How are their wages increasing? What are the prospects for future employment? So I think there's a lot of social issues and economic issues in Europe as well, in countries that people think are quite rich and certainly are showing much higher per capita GDP than Malaysia. So I think it's a unique issue in Malaysia where people feel that they're not as successful as they would hope. In a way, it's good because it means that Malaysians want to do better and they're not just satisfied with being where they are, and they want to get into the advanced income category, which is good.
So it's a form of check and balances towards the government, I guess.
I mean, obviously there's always issues about, how to broaden the number of people who are benefiting from the growth of the economy. And I think, education is one of the key issues that, if we look at where Malaysia needs to be in, say, 10 years' time to become a knowledge economy, one of the areas that needs to continue to develop is human capital. Malaysia cannot be a sustainable knowledge economy without a very big increase in the number of highly qualified people. So I think the educated workforce is going to have to grow a great deal.
So that's one of the indicator for Malaysia to be able to sustain itself as a high income nation in the future.
Absolutely. I think it's very critical for Malaysia to be able to compete in knowledge industries such as financial services, medical services, IT sector, areas such as aviation, which is now, Malaysia is one of the strong areas that it's got a big hub for international aviation. So, whichever of these knowledge areas or industries that you look at, it does need a highly skilled workforce. So training at university standards, but also vocational training are very, very important. I would compare, the case of Germany. Germany has very strong vocational education, not only for university training, but to train skilled, technical workers for manufacturing industry. So that's one of the strengths of their economy, so that they have highly capable vocational training. And that's developed in conjunction with industry, so it's not only theoretical. These training programs normally have close involvement of the company sector as well. So I think when we look over the next 10 years, I can see a lot of potential for Malaysia to continue to build up its tertiary education as well as vocational education systems.
So right now, what is sustaining Malaysia's GDP? Is it sectors that uses a lot of the knowledge workforce, or is based on the knowledge economy, or more towards manufacturing, more towards the I guess the industry that was popular 10 years ago during Mahathir's time?
I think originally Malaysia evolved in the 1960s and 1970s with relatively basic skills in the workforce. But since then, there is now a relatively well-educated workforce. Many have, tertiary education. But when we look at where will Malaysia compete in future, this has to evolve more. Right now, the exports of Malaysia are quite wide-ranging across commodities such as palm oil, oil and gas, and some other agricultural commodities, tin, as well as manufacturing exports. Electronics is still very important, but also services exports. I think looking forward, the most important growth sectors for the future are going to be the service sector exports. Already Malaysia has a big tourism hub. It has exports of financial services, and it also has the IT business process outsourcing industry as well. But I think there's going to be a lot of scope for these to grow more. And because these are knowledge industries in general, this is a very important way for Malaysia to become a higher value-adding economy, to justify those kind of high per capita GDP levels. Because it's hard to compete anymore in just the basic manufacturing. There's other countries around Asia which are competing strongly in basic electronic type processing. Vietnam's now coming up at very low wage costs and exporting semiconductor chips.
In fact, there's a saying that other countries, other neighboring countries in Southeast Asia, once they move up to the level where Malaysia was 20 years ago, which is focusing a lot more on manufacturing, on primary commodities, Malaysia have to move one step upper than them, or not we'll not be able to reach the goal of becoming a high-income nation.
That's exactly right, and that's why I think that the future is very much about developing a highly skilled workforce and developing these key industry sectors and services. But I think fortunately for Malaysia, because of the very rapid growth of the rest of ASEAN, with countries like Indonesia growing strongly, also Philippines, and then even the less developed countries like Vietnam, Myanmar, these countries are countries that are not strong in exports of services. So Malaysia has quite a strong competitive advantage to benefit from the demand for services that will come from these countries. For example, in the area of education, I think there's a lot of potential for Malaysia to become a education export hub for ASEAN. Malaysia still has a lot of available land to build university campuses, and also has quite skilled workers who can teach at the universities.
Anyway, we'll take one short break.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene, and you're back again with me on our Monday Morning Matters. So, regarding on Malaysia, on the path towards a high-income nation by 2020, we have Rajiv Biswas again will be sharing with us on why he thinks that Malaysia will become a high-income country. And just to continue our discussion, why do you think so? Like, what are the indicators or the key pointers or projections that you foresee in terms of GDP, in terms of growth that Malaysia will go through on the path towards 2020?
We're expecting that Malaysia can grow at about 5.2% per year over the next 4 or 5 years. This year will be a bit lower than that because of the impact of the lower oil price on the Malaysian economy. But beyond, 2015, the growth rate should be back over 5% per year. What that means is that per capita GDP for Malaysia is expected to double over the next decade from about $10,000 per person in US dollar terms this year to over $20,000 per person by 2025. And already by 2020, Malaysia would be classified as a high-income country according to the World Bank definitions and classifications. So it's really on the threshold of entering a relatively small group of countries in Asia that have a high income. Of course, Malaysia will be coming in at the lower end of that group because some of those countries have really quite high income levels, such as Hong Kong or Japan or Singapore. But nevertheless, it will be in that categorization. Mm-hmm. What I think that means is that also Malaysia will have a bigger role to play in terms of, leadership in the region. People will be looking more towards Malaysia as a standard setter in areas such as financial services, economic policy. So, it does bring more responsibilities as well to enter that group of nations.
Mm-hmm. Do you think right now Malaysia's economic policy, the NEM, new economic model, is working towards Malaysia to go into a high-income nation by 2020?
I think it's exactly along the right strategy of focusing on high value-added industries for the future. In particular, there's many service industries that are identified as key growth areas, and I think that's where the future will be for Malaysia. I don't think anymore that Malaysia can compete in the low-end manufacturing. Mm-hmm. That's clear that that's already shifting to other countries. In the high-end manufacturing, I think Malaysia will be able to, compete in some areas of high-end manufacturing, but it's services that gives the greatest opportunities, mm-hmm. particularly exports of education, tourism, medical services, and also the IT BPO sector, mm-hmm. Which is not just call centers, but much more sophisticated outsourcing of many forms of business analysis.
Would it be similar with India when it comes to that kind of IT/call center services?
I think it already has established its position as one of the most competitive hubs in the world for the IT BPO industry after India. And I think one of the big advantages of Malaysia is that it has a high level of university-educated workforce, as well as having English language skills. That's crucial because most of the IT BPO work does come to English-speaking countries. So that's why India, Philippines, Malaysia are the ones that are getting most of these kind of areas of work. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge competitive advantage for Malaysia. Already in KL, there's quite a hub for IT BPO. Some very big banks already have their back offices in KL. It's also quite exciting to see that a new IT BPO park is being built in Penang, which is expected to create around 21,000 new IT BPO jobs by 2020. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge positive for Penang as well going forward.
Do you foresee any other states that will be doing very well in the coming years besides Penang and Kuala Lumpur?
I think it's very important now that the government focuses on creating momentum in the economy of Johor and Iskandar, because a lot of money is going into developing the infrastructure in Iskandar. But I think there's a lot of potential to also make Iskandar quite a hub for manufacturing, also for IT BPO. There's a lot of potential for that area to grow more. So I think that's actually quite a priority to have in parallel with the development of the urban infrastructure, also to have sufficient employment to go in parallel with that. So one of the areas I think that could do very well is education, not only in Iskandar, of course, but in other areas as well. So we could see many other of the cities of Malaysia benefiting from having campuses for students who are going to come from all over the region.
And we're already seeing it right now.
Yeah, I think we're already seeing that. There's, a number of universities that have been established in Malaysia as joint projects together with foreign universities abroad, and they're doing quite well. But I think there could be many more in the future. And these could become quite big sources of employment, because, one university town can generate, tens of thousands of jobs. So the university itself is quite a significant export of education services, and also creates high-paying jobs in the knowledge industry. And the reason education should do well is because there's a huge need for training, for education from the countries around Malaysia who don't have very high education standards. Particularly Indonesia, I think there's a huge need for human capital skills to increase, but also Vietnam, Myanmar. There's other countries that need that kind of training. So Malaysia can benefit from that. Even India, I think there's a huge demand from Indian students to study abroad as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's another potential market. Our campuses with China anyway.
Yeah. Glad that you mentioned that, because this is based on just rough observation by myself, even looking at majority of the students, international students that come to Malaysia. Not all of them are from Southeast Asia, and for AEC, ASEAN Economic Community, demanding more movement of skilled labor. So if Malaysia can see itself as the hub for education, the immediate neighboring country should be coming to Malaysia to study, and there's a huge market, seems like, a potential one.
Yeah, and I think people are also comfortable to send their children to Malaysia because it has quite a good reputation as a education hub, and many families already send their students there, so there's a trust that it's a good country to send your family to for education, and the standards have been quite good. There's a number of universities that have already performed very well, so there's a good track record already. So I think that has a lot of potential. And of course, once students come over, then the family may want to buy a home. So it also could help the investment into the property sector. So there's a lot of positives that can come out of those kind of relations, as has happened in England for many decades. That, for many years, England has also been a hub for that kind of flow of students from all over the world. But I think now, the UK has become extremely expensive, so people are also looking for other options, and Malaysia certainly could enter that space in a big way.
If Malaysia is foreseeing itself developing all these different services industry, how can Malaysia improve its business climate so that people don't feel hostile when they come to Malaysia? They feel that they want to do business here, and it is easier for them to set up business here.
I think in general, there's still a relatively positive view about Malaysia. In terms of the ease of doing business index, Malaysia does rank very high globally. So it's already considered a relatively easy place to do business. One thing, kind of anecdotally, that a lot of people mention when I talk to them in terms of foreigners working in Malaysia, that concerns them is just the level of petty crime. It's not so much serious crime, but I think they do compare, for example, that in Singapore it's very safe, or Tokyo, so it's very safe. But in Malaysia, there's always burglaries and, snatching of purses and all that sort of thing. So I think more police efforts are also needed to improve the image of Malaysia in that area, which does come up quite a lot amongst foreign business people when they mention their experience in Malaysia. So it just gives a bad, overall impression when many other things are very positive. That's one thing that people tend to.
So crime is one thing.
Yeah, I would say so, because people very much like the open spaces, the lifestyle in Malaysia. So it's really the only negative I keep hearing about is this kind of petty crime that seems to be quite an issue. But otherwise, most expatriates very much like being in Malaysia.
But what about other areas such as corruption, addressing issue in terms of tapes and all that? Is Malaysia a country that is still not yet there when it comes to ease of doing business and dealing with the government?
Malaysia is ranked, very high globally at the moment in terms of the ease of doing business. So in terms of the government procedures and processes, it's very, very favorable in Malaysia. I think in terms of corruption, I think there were concerns historically that, Malaysia had a relatively high level of corruption. But I think there has been a lot of progress towards addressing those issues over the last, I would say, 5 years in particular. And it's clear that corruption is an issue across many Asian developing countries. But if you look at where is Malaysia ranked, it has improved somewhat in the corruption rankings, so it's doing better in that area. And if you compare it to other ASEAN countries like Vietnam or Myanmar, it's obviously far ahead of those countries as being a much better anti-corruption environment. So although there is still progress to be made in this area, there's no doubt that the standards are improving.
Anyway, we'll take another one short break.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene. You're back with me again on the topic of Malaysia. Is it a high-income country or will it be a high-income country by 2020? And we have Rajiv Biswas from the Asia Pacific Chief Economist at IHS. So there's a lot of challenges that Malaysia may need to address, especially when it comes to political challenges. And of course, you mentioned earlier on more on the business and economic side. If there's areas that Malaysia need to address in terms of its politics, what are those areas?
Well, I think every country has its, political system. Obviously, Malaysia is a, democratic system, and that's a big advantage for Malaysia. That although there are, political divides in the country and some differences, at least when you look at it from the domestic national perspective, that sometimes the arguments can get quite heated amongst the different parties. Nevertheless, if you stand back and look at Malaysia's position as a democracy compared to many other Asian countries, it is relatively a stable political system. And for investors, that's the key issue. That is it a stable democracy, stable political system? And it does seem to be, for many years considered a very stable country in terms of the political environment. So I think that's a big positive for Malaysia compared to many other countries where the political environment is much more subject to uncertainty.
So, regardless of whichever political camp in Malaysia becoming the future government in future general elections, Malaysia will still be seen as a stable country. Would that be the case?
I mean, it depends on the policies of a future government. One can't give a blank check to every future government and assume that they'll have the right policies. If a government changes and a new government comes in, they may have different policies. It's not known in advance how that could play out. So there's always risk when you have change of parties, and especially if you go further out into the future, one can't really be sure, cannot predict what kind of parties may be in government and what kind of policies they may wish to pursue. But certainly when you look over the last few decades, Malaysia in general has been pursuing reasonably good economic policies. I would certainly say that in the last decade the macroeconomic management has been very good. In the last 5 years, if you look at the economy, it's been growing at a consistently healthy rate of about 5%, even 6% in some years. And inflation has been kept under control by the central bank. The currency has been relatively stable. All currencies have some volatility depending on what's happening with the US dollar and so on. But I think we've seen a relatively stable economic environment. And the export sector has been relatively healthy. And Malaysia has enjoyed a good current account surplus. So on all of these macroeconomic measures, at least the current government has really pursued sound economic policies. And the latest decisions to get rid of fuel subsidies and introduce a GST are actually very important reforms and really saved Malaysia from serious problems this year. Had these reforms not been implemented, the fall in oil prices would have hit the fiscal situation very hard. And right now, the fiscal deficit looks like it'll probably be in the order of just over 3% of GDP, which is reasonably moderate. But had those reforms not been done with reducing fuel subsidies and introducing a GST, the fiscal deficit could have blown out.
But these are really unpopular policy choice that the Najib's government has made. Why only now? Why in the past, during different prime ministers or former prime ministers, they didn't really focus on that particular area?
I think these are very politically unpopular, and especially removing fuel subsidies. The normal electorate, don't like those kind of changes because they've got used to having cheap fuel, and they don't like to be, having to pay the market price. GST also affects, all households. The way they see it, prices go up, and they feel they're just having to pay more for everything. But if you look around the world, every country pretty much has got a GST in place. It's a good fiscal reform. It's a relatively sound way of raising revenue. And I think one of the important things over time is that if the GST is working successfully, it should also be accompanied by gradual reductions in income tax as well. Because I think that should allow scope for reducing other kinds of taxes if the GST is performing reasonably well. So I think these have been good reforms and should stand Malaysia in good stead over the long term. Certainly there should never be a move back towards bringing in fuel subsidies, because even if oil prices go up, that it would be a mistake to again bring in fuel subsidies, because they're very costly. And it's not a good use of the government revenue to do that. What they should be doing with the extra revenue they're saving from not having these fuel subsidies is investing much more in infrastructure, or they can also be lowering other kinds of tax. And
when it comes to Malaysia's political challenges, I think one of the most tiring questions, probably you get it all the time as well, is the Bumiputra policy. Would it hinder Malaysia from becoming a high-income nation by 2020?
Well, these policies are already in place. So even with those policies, our expectation is with the current status quo, the economy will reach that high-income status in 5 years' time. So it's on its way to becoming an advanced economy. the question may be better asked whether it could grow faster without those policies. But I mean, that's an issue for the domestic electorate to decide how they want to position on this issue. So it's obviously I know there's a heated debate in Malaysia about these topics, but in terms of the overall performance of the economy at the moment, it's still growing at a relatively good pace of about 5% per year, which isn't bad for a middle-income country. Indonesia is a relatively low-income country, and it's growing at 5%. So for a relatively almost high-income country like Malaysia to be growing at 5% per year is quite a good outcome.
But will this mean that Malaysia might stuck or be trapped as a middle-income country and not be able to move up one step further as a high-income?
I think it's going to be a high-income country in 5 years' time, and that's based on the current strategy. So I don't have much doubt that Malaysia is going to become a high-income country very soon. So I don't see that Malaysia will be trapped in the middle-income category. I think the countries that are most at risk of being stuck in the middle-income trap are those that are very reliant on manufacturing, such as Thailand, China, because their economies were dependent on low-cost manufacturing, and they don't have the economic base to suddenly develop their services exports and knowledge industries like education or medical services, IT, BPO. These don't exist in any big way in these countries. So I think Malaysia's advantage is that it has already got quite a lot of service industries, and the future growth will be driven by the service industries. So that's quite a different situation to what we see in some of these other ASEAN countries, which have been concentrating on manufacturing, and then suddenly their competitiveness is being eroded, and then they're struggling to find other growth industries. So Malaysia does have, I think, the right strategy through the economic transformation program of developing high value-added industries and services, and also in some areas of manufacturing as well.
What else that Malaysia would be or should develop in terms of industry in order for them to be seen as having a huge pool of knowledge workforce, or having a larger pie of their economy is based on knowledge economy, besides services, of course?
Well, I think the biggest opportunity has to be in services. Agriculture has its limitations. There is agricultural exports, but it's difficult to get a lot of high value added.
What about heavy industry?
And again, the competitiveness of heavy industry will be limited. Maybe in areas like petrochemicals, where Malaysia does have the feedstock, that could be an area where there is competitive advantage. But more widely, it's hard to compete in many other heavy industries. Those are sectors that are, have been facing a lot of competitive challenges around the world. So I don't think the future for Malaysia needs to be in those kind of old industries. The future has to be in the high value added, if you like, knowledge industries. That's where the advantage will be for Malaysia.
And with ASEAN, of course, I want to focus more on ASEAN right now, especially the ASEAN economic community. Do you think it would actually spur Malaysia even faster as a high-income nation, because ASEAN itself has so much market opportunity and so much more I would say complementary to the growth that Malaysia needs, especially Malaysia can provide the kind of services that its neighboring countries would like to tap into.
Yes, I certainly think the ASEAN economic community is a big opportunity for Malaysia, because you're going to see closer integration in trade and services. In future, probably there'll be some reduction in barriers on investment flows as well. But there's already been a deal done this year on ASEAN Open Skies, which is creating liberalization in the air transport industry. central bank governors of ASEAN have agreed a deal on closer integration in banking. So we're already seeing quite a lot of progress, and more will be achieved when leaders meet at the end of this year and sign the AEC agreement. So for a country like Malaysia, which is very strong in the banking sector, this is a good opportunity because it means Malaysia will have market access to other countries in ASEAN. Already a deal has been signed with Indonesia, and there will be deals with other countries as well. So Malaysian banks will be able to expand their operations around the ASEAN region. Mm-hmm. And of course they're also expanding elsewhere, not only in ASEAN, but ASEAN's probably the biggest area of competitive advantage for Malaysia, since it's so proximate.
But will we be the biggest competitor with Singapore, since it's also seeing itself as a hub for finance and services industry?
I think in financial services, that's true, that the Malaysian banks will also have to compete with the Singapore banks, who also have the same idea of expanding around ASEAN. But, I think there's room for both, Singaporean banks and Malaysian banks. It's a big enough growth market to accommodate both groups of banks. And there will be other banks trying to compete as well. But I think amongst the ASEAN economies, Singapore and Malaysia are the leaders in banking service exports. There will be opportunities in other areas in banking and financial services, such as insurance, fund management as well. But these may evolve over time. So I think a lot of opportunities are opening up for the financial services industry to export around the ASEAN region.
With that, thank you very much, Mr. Rajiv Biswas.
Thank you.